Welcome everybody to the webinar today. Before we begin, I want to turn it over just for a moment or two to the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government, Dr. Mark Roselle.
Great. Thank you, David. Delighted to be here. And thank you, everybody, for attending. On behalf of the Schar School of Policy and Government here at George Mason University, I want to thank you for being with us today. The Schar School's location, by the way, makes us really ideal for technology. Northern Virginia, right? Assorted levels of government, federal, state, local, all right here, and the academic world here at Mason, of course, to all come together to share their best thinking on ways that the public sector can work even better to improve constituent outcomes on vital programs to American society. So you're going to hear more about that later in the webinar. We have a robotic process automation initiative. I know it's a mouthful, but this is a rather important initiative of the school. And this is really the first of its kind. So we welcome you to be more involved with the Schar School to learn about these programs. And today's seminar is a start toward that end. So with that, thank you for attending. And let me turn it over to the director of the Center for Business Civic Engagement, Professor David Rare. David?
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for being with us. Welcome, everyone, and we are glad you're with us today. As Mark mentioned, I am Dr. David Rare, Director of the Center for Business Civic Engagement at the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Since this is the first webinar of a series we're scheduling into the future, I want to take a moment to explain how this webinar fits into the mission of the center and the center's recent announcement of the Robotics Process Automation, RPA initiative. The overall mission of the center is to see what practices or principles used in the private sector can be applied to the public sector to help the public sector be even more efficient and effective. And we see with the growing decline in trust in government that we need to do everything we can to build constituent trust and to make sure people are feeling like they're getting the value in their government, which they're working hard to invest in through their tax dollars. Our RPA initiative naturally flows out of this mission. Over a year ago, I and the center's staff began to notice how RPA technologies were aiding in the fight on COVID-19. We were all frankly amazed by the technology and how it could be deployed effectively. Our conversation led us to discussion with personnel from UiPath, one of the top RPA innovators in the world, which is headquartered in New York City. My interest in pursuing a more effective and efficient government brought me to the conclusion that the use of RPA could make a real difference for our citizens. Our conversations led to a partnership with UiPath around the RPA initiative, and its announcement generated more than 12 million media impressions. So it has a lot of lift in the marketplace and in society. The mission of the RPA initiative is to research, educate, and communicate, especially congressional staff, members of Congress, federal officials, and state and local elected officials, how the adoption of this emerging technology can improve productivity, operations, and service delivery of public sector organizations. The initiative will also study and recommend possible governance models and public policy initiatives for RPA deployment in the context of the broader economic outlook and the future of work. We welcome those in the RPA sector and today's attendees, each and all of you, to join us in our efforts on the RPA initiative to exponentially accelerate its adoption in the public sector. On today's first webinar, Advancement of Robotic Process Automation in the Public Sector. And we have a combination of IT people and non-IT people, so we can talk about this subject. And I'm very excited to kick off the webinar series with Mr. Chris Townsend Area Vice President, Public Sector, UiPath. Welcome, Chris.
Oh, thank you so much, David and Mark and the Center for Business and Civic Engagement. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here today and looking forward to the conversation.
Let me just introduce Chris so you know his expertise very quickly. Chris provides leadership to government sales and operations, UiPath's team, as they work to accelerate the adoption of RPA across the U.S., federal, state, and local governments. Chris has an impressive track record working with fast growth companies and positioning them for significant growth across the public sector. Prior to joining UiPath, Chris worked in a variety of leadership roles at companies we all know and heard of, including Intel Security and Cisco Systems. He's on multiple boards, including the DC chapter of the Armed Services Communications and the Electronics Association, the Advanced Academic Research Center, and is an active supporter of Leukemia and the Lymphoma Society, as I am myself, which is why I included that. Now, Chris, as we get deeper into the topic of RPA, can you give us kind of a brief history of RPA and the benefits of the technology for institutions and workers or employees?
I would love to, David. Thank you very much. And again, great being here with you today. So throughout human history, people have been trying to automate repetitive, mundane processes. This is really nothing new. And if you look back to, the ancient Greeks and the Romans are as recent in our own history. If you look at Eli Whitney and the automation that really drove a lot of the growth in agriculture, automation has been here for a long time. But robotic process automation is a little different. And let me talk about how robotic process automation kind of fits in this overall productivity curve that we've been on since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. So if you look at productivity of a worker since mechanization and automation really kicked in the early part of the last century, our productivity curve has been on a steep up and to the right growth trajectory and was accelerated through the IT era. But that productivity is now starting to, it's still increasing, but it's increasing at a decreasing rate. So it's flattening out, if you will. And we believe the reason for that is our IT systems are so powerful. They're generating so much information and so much data that it's overwhelming the people now that are tasked with collecting, aggregating, analyzing, and reporting on that information, then ultimately taking some action. We're tasking our human workers with managing all of that information and data that then take some type of action. And that's really where robotic process automation comes in. Robotic process automation is a software package that runs on an endpoint, runs in the server, runs in the cloud, where you can automate any human activity in terms of interface with applications, spreadsheets, email, web pages, really anything that doesn't require a heavy cognitive input or doesn't require a lot of thought. Now, we are building in more and more AI capability to that, so we can do things like handwritten recognition, unstructured data, do things like image recognition, and build that AI into our workflow. But at the end of the day, what robotic process automation is it's essentially a digital assistant capability that can automate business processes and perform tasks that most humans can, but that are repetitive, mundane, and just a bit of a grind. And the impact to the workers that we're seeing that are adopting robotics process automation, because initially there's some trepidation that, hey, is this automation going to affect my job or take work away? And we're seeing the exact opposite. As a matter of fact, workers are empowered, they're excited. Most people don't want to do that boring, mundane, repetitive stuff. They want to do things that require thought, that require innovation. And in government, it's all about the mission, right? How can we better support the citizenry? How can we better serve the constituents of the agencies? And this technology really facilitates that. And if we look at the impact of the institutions that this technology can affect, the return on investment, whether you measure that in terms of cost avoidance, capacity, improved productivity, is tremendous. We're seeing return on investment often in less than 90 days. So I think we're just scratching the surface of what we're doing in terms of RPA and government, and look forward to talking to you more about this as we go through the rest of the interview.
Well, thanks, Chris.
And David, I'd like to ask you a question now as we go through. So you've got a really impressive resume, right? PhD in economics, former capital staffer, lobbyist, association CEO. you're tuned into the workings of Washington and the national economic conditions. I'd like to get your perspective on this. I know you've been doing some work around RPA now with George Mason. How do you view historical adoption and technology, and what's the economic world outlook for America now that we've come out of this pandemic? And what do you think our elected officials will be focused on, especially under the new administration, in the next 3 to 5 years? I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Yeah, well, thanks, Chris. I think a lot about it all the time. A couple things. First off, we've all read all the books on adoption of technology in America or the world. You've got your early adopters, and you have like the laggards, and you have the people who are kicking and screaming to turn the electricity on. And I think that's probably going to play out in RPA as well. You've got some very innovative people, especially at the GSA, the IRS, who are really initiating programs, and we'll probably talk about that a little later. But there's a lot of people, frankly, who don't know about it. And one of the things that I've discovered in my years on Capitol Hill and my reference to members of Congress is, as you mentioned, Chris, there's so much going on around them, so much information that they're consuming, they almost become paralyzed by it. And I think that's a challenge for new technologies or new ideas. I remember just talking with a former student a couple of weeks ago who works on Capitol Hill on the Ways and Means Committee, who said to me, David, this pandemic has really changed the way we work. I used to get 500 emails a day. Now I get 2,000. And I thought to myself, if you worked all day, you probably couldn't get through the 2,000, let alone doing all the other work of writing speeches, drafting legislation, looking at your colleagues. So how can you move it in advance and get things done for your member of Congress? And it's a real challenge. So we have kind of this historical technology embracing going on. We have the pandemic, which is good and bad. I mean, it's bad that all these people are tragically being killed and stuff. But I think the positive of the pandemic has been it's made us look at things differently. For example, when I was an association CEO, I would never let people work at home. The common wisdom was people who work at home are shirking, which is an economic term for not doing their job. But since we've all been forced to do that, and we're using Zoom and we're using other technologies, it's probably as or more productive than it was when I was opposing it years ago. So that bodes well for robotic process automation, because I think it allows people to see, well, I didn't really like Zoom, now I love Zoom. Maybe get a little tired of it, but I stay connected. Or now I only have to go in 1 day a week rather than 5 days a week. And I think that's positive. I also think one of the challenges for members of Congress with this onslaught of information is, who do you believe? Right? We all have different news services that we follow, and one says X good, X bad. And then you're like, what's really the truth? What's really going on here? You don't really know, because the number of objective services for news or media in general, and I say that respectively, as former head of the Broadcasters Association, is it's really unclear to people what they can trust. So I think that means what we're doing, what you're doing, what all the companies, what everyone's doing in the sector is doing, really has to focus on developing their reputations, the trust going on in the technology, to make sure people know that if they're doing things, they're getting the result. You mentioned the rate of return, that's what they care about. And I think that leads to more positive adoption. And then let me say finally, Chris, I think it's going to be hard. We're going to have to be innovative in ways of financing this. Because if you just think in the last week, rightly or wrongly, we've spent or we've promised to spend $4 trillion. Now, for our audience, that's $1 billion 1,000 times 4. And I think the pressure will come down when the stock market maybe gets jitters, or gold prices go up, or silver prices maybe go up. People will then say, can't spend anymore, have to look for ways to cut. Congress is like a pendulum, and it tends to overreact. So that will spook people into saying the first thing we can neglect or forget is good technology. So we'll have to figure out ways to kind of confront that. I think a great way is the rate of return, but you still have to find people who have the guts or the predilection to say this will really make things work better. That's for we should try it, experiment with one project, then go on from there when it works.
So how do you think the public sector is going to deal with this change, right? The change in budget and funding and working through the whole technology modernization, digital modernization challenge?
Well, I'll tell you initially what my wife, Ashley, told me when I was head of the NAB and we were doing the analog to digital TV transition, which was the largest technological change in America. She looked at me and she said, people don't like change. People don't like change. I mean, sometimes they're forced into it. Maybe they begrudgingly accept it. But I think we're going to have to figure out how we not have people get spooked by change. You know, you mentioned the Industrial Revolution. We don't want the Luddites who are famous for breaking technology so they could use the old techniques of yarn weaving and stuff, and were afraid of what would happen to them. The good news is that technology, all technology, has always led to greater economic growth, greater job options, and greater value for everyone. So that's a positive, but I think we're gonna have to figure out how we deal with these cultural issues so people don't get spooked and try to fight change, particularly when the change bodes well. Now, one good thing, and now let's get back to you, Chris, and ask you a question, is that members of Congress know that people are engaged in government, in fact, engaged in all levels of government less. So they're thinking in the back of their mind, and they're motivated by many things, but including their reelection chances. How do we get people to like government more? How do we get people to like me more? So what do we need to do to show that we hear you and that we're responding? And that's where I think this kind of RPA technology could really help, because it is so amazing in my mind that people will instantly know when they go out to fill out an HR form, they just scan in their driver's license and the entire form is filled out for them and there are no errors. And I think that bodes well for us. So it's kind of a mixed double-edged sword, so to speak. Now, let me go ahead and ask you a question, Chris, if I can. History is filled with people being nervous about new technologies, as I mentioned, the great example of being the Luddites. Explain how RPA works. I mean, kind of the process and the inclusion, and maybe a few examples of success, if you're at liberty to say, on the impact it has on workers' productivity, service delivery, and workplace culture. And then I noticed that UiPath in particular has really focused on the phrase automation for good. And what do you guys mean by automation for good? And how does that play into this kind of cultural challenge?
Oh, well, absolutely, David. Thank you. So first off, there's always some trepidation with new technology. We've been talking about that, right, for the last few minutes. There's always concern about how this is going to impact me. What we're finding, though, is automation and RPA has really become a job creation engine as well. So we're reskilling, for example, in the USDA, we're on our third reskilling class now, where we're taking folks that are outside of IT, outside of technology, and reskilling them into RPA developers, because USDA's had a pretty significant RPA practice through UiPath for the last couple of years. So they're one of the leaders in the adoption of RPA, and we're helping reskill their workforce into filling this demand for RPA jobs, and we're doing that, you know, across the country. So we are creating jobs, not consuming jobs. But in the public sector in particular, the federal government workforce has been flat for 40 years. We haven't added new government workers. In fact, the government workforce in federal is actually down a bit since the 80s. So we have tasked our federal employees to do more with less, service a larger population, service more government programs, drive more complexity with less capacity. So automation is going to help our government workforce offload those mundane, repetitive tasks so they can really focus on, and you hit the nail on the head, delivering the services that the citizens expect without the wait times and the call hold times and the delays in getting the claims process and the backlogs that exist. And COVID has exacerbated a lot of those backlogs. So automation is going to make our government workforce more productive, allow them to serve the citizenry better, allow them to get the services in the hands of the folks that need them when they need them, and not have to them to fight through a lot of process and complexity. And I'll share some examples with you. So we started out in the back office. UiPath and automation really started around finance, HR, IT services. But what we've done is really expanded outside of that now to supporting mission and solving mission problems, big complex problems for the agencies that we support. And that's what's most exciting to me, is how do we deliver better care and service to the veteran? How do we process that disability claim at Social Security more quickly? How do we process, and look, and I'll start with this example first. So during the challenges with COVID, there were a lot of people out of work in New York, right? There's a lot of people out of work across the country. And there was a tremendous backlog of unemployment claims. And the New York State folks are trying to work through that as quickly as they can at the Department of Labor within New York to get the benefits in the hands of these folks that are out of work. They need to pay their bills, they need to feed their kids, and they couldn't get those benefits out quickly enough. So they worked with us to automate that process and work through that backlog. And they worked through millions of backlog unemployment claims to get the benefits in the hands of the folks that needed them as quickly as they possibly could. And it was a tremendous success story. But we've done the same thing at Department of Veterans Affairs, for example. So the VA implemented the Mission Act or the Community Care Act that allows veterans to go outside of the VA to receive care if they're a certain distance from a medical center or they want to visit a specialist that's outside of the VA network. Tremendously successful program. The veterans loved it. They loved it so much, it created this huge influx of paper records back into the VA, because once you saw a doc outside of the VA network, you had to bring a physical record back that was then loaded in the VA electronic health record system. It created literally stacks of paper and file cabinets and rooms that they had to repurpose. The VA had to repurpose upwards of 10 people per medical center to work through all these backlog claims. And they still weren't able to keep up with the influx of this paperwork. And a lot of it was, like I said, was actually physical documents that were sent over. A lot of it was handwritten. And it was slowing the ability of the VA to administer this program, because what would happen is if a veteran went in and let's say they got 5 referrals to see a chiropractor for pain management, and they use up their 5 referrals, they go back to the VA to get 5 more referrals. The VA says, well, hey, you still have 3 referrals outstanding. Well, that was because they were stacked up in a room someplace and hadn't been processed. So we used robotic process automation in partnership with a couple of medical centers to prove out that we could automate the processing of these documents, these records, and flow them back into the electronic health record system. And if you think about that, right, you're taking a piece of paper, you set it on the desk, and you're looking at some fields and you're entering that information back into the electronic health record system. It doesn't take any cognitive input, really. You're just transferring data from one source to another. So we automated that process, and we were able to process these records at 2x or 3x what these 10 people were able to do. So number one, we could put the 10 people back to their day jobs and save the VA a tremendous amount in overtime. And more importantly, we were able to more quickly process these records, so it allowed the veterans to receive the care on time and facilitate the success of the program. And they've now deployed that at a number of medical centers and are looking to do it enterprise-wide across the VA. Another example, and I could go on and on and on, and I won't. Another example is at the Social Security Administration. Social Security just did a very large deployment of UiPath automation. They had a backlog of disability claims, and we built some automations that allowed them to expedite the processing of those disability claims and get that claim in the hands of the folks that needed it much more quickly, and really accelerate the whole process of working through these claims. And we've got automations that work in contact centers. We've got automations that work in document processing. So we're really just scratching the surface. We're doing a lot of really exciting things around compliance. We're doing some great things at the Air Force. They've got, they're looking at automating C-17 maintenance schedules and in processing and out processing of personnel as they move from base to base, and visit requests at the bases to be able to accelerate folks moving in and out, in and out of bases. So we're just really scratching the surface of what we can do with this technology. And, you asked the question about, reboot work and how we're looking at this as a fundamental change in the way people work. And we really believe, and I'll tell you, David, I've been here 18, 19 months now, and I've never seen the excitement around a new technology, especially in government, that I'm seeing around RPA. This is really going to break down the outworn, outmoded, mundane approach that we've had to handling this data and handling work by empowering workers to offload these repetitive, mindless, mundane tasks and focus more on ideas and innovation. And that's all about, again, in government supporting the mission, improving the ability to deliver the right service to the citizen on time, reducing fraud, reducing errors, and making government function more efficiently.
Yeah, I think that's excellent, Chris. I know that, again, bringing up the members of Congress, when I was a staffer, the number one complaint I would get from people back in our district in southwestern Minnesota is, where's my check? And I couldn't say, well, it's being processed. And they'd say, by some stupid bureaucrat. And I'd be like, they're not really stupid. They're working really hard. But I do think this whole non-technology oriented 40 years has really kind of bummed a lot of people in government out, where I've seen studies that show people are less likely to work in government than before. They have a bad taste in government because they think a lot of it's like bureaucracy at its worst, because it's mundane and boring, where if we can free them of that, they can really focus on, as an economist, high value things. Are the services really working? Can I visit Wilmer, Minnesota and go to the food bank there and make sure it's really touching the people it's intended to touch? And I think that's a good thing. Well, we talked a little bit about the public sector, Chris. Let me transition just quickly, and we don't have to really focus too much time on this, but the private sector has openly embraced RPA. And can you talk about some of the major, without getting into too specifics, some of the major like blue chip companies that you're engaged with or RPA is engaged with, and what they're...
Absolutely. If you look at the largest global companies, the Fortune 500, we're in almost all of those, and they're using our technology in a number of different ways, whether it's the financial vertical, the healthcare vertical, retail, oil and gas, manufacturing. They're all adopting robotic process automation and AI to solve problems and to function more efficiently. And I'll give you a couple of examples. So most of the large banks are using UiPath, RPA in some capacity or another. And I'll tie this back to government because I think this will be relevant to a lot of the folks on this call and your viewers. Obviously, when the PPP loans came out, it was a really important program to get those PPP benefits in the hands of small business owners and allow them to keep their folks employed and working, and keep our small businesses afloat while we navigate this really difficult time of COVID. So we were working with the Small Business Administration and said, hey, you should look at using RPA to process these PPP loans because otherwise, we're worried you're going to be overwhelmed with the amount of the data that you have coming at you. And they felt that they were in a good position and really just didn't have the resources to move forward with it at that time. Well, what happened was the banks were all using our automation to process these PPP loan applications to be able to get the benefits out as quickly as they could, and essentially overwhelmed the SBA to the point that the SBA had to put out a memo to the banks, hey, please stop using RPA to process these applications because we can't handle the influx. And they went out and they hired like 500 temps to help process it. But that's kind of the old thinking to the new thinking, right? Let's use technology to solve the problem. And I'm not being critical of anybody at SBA. Their hands were tied. They really didn't have a choice, and they just needed to solve the problem as quickly as they did. And I'll tell you, our government customers were doubly burdened with this COVID-19. They had to navigate the telework challenge that everyone else had to navigate, and they had to administer all these COVID programs. So they got an additional workload while they were trying to deal with balancing the capacity challenge of people working remotely, and a lot of systems that didn't support remote work. But that's just one example of how some of our financial customers used our technology to solve a workforce scalability challenge, right? And be able to scale their workforce on demand, which is one of the benefits of RPA. Another example tied back to healthcare and COVID-19. The testing protocol required that a patient registered and test kits are correctly labeled for collection and reporting. It was a manual process and often drove upwards of a 6-hour wait time for patients. So many of our large healthcare customers, including one of the largest hospitals in the US, set up and deployed an attended robot in 48 hours. So in 40 days time, we stood up this robot, or 2 days time, stood up this robot to check if you're already a patient, if the patient was registered. Again, all that mindless stuff that a lot of what we're asking the humans to do, just going in the database and making sure that these are the right folks at the right hospital with the right benefits. And then the bot would correctly select the right printer, print the label, and what took a human 2 or 3 minutes to execute manually, we could do in 14 to 16 seconds with a bot. So we saved a tremendous amount of time and shortened that wait time, and we're able to get more tests out there more quickly. So, again, I've got example after example after example in the private sector where organizations are really benefiting from this technology. And the last example I give you, before I joined UiPath and doing some due diligence, I talked to a banking customer. And they said, Chris, we automate everything we can. And I said, wow, no kidding. Why do you do that? And they said, it's the only technology we've ever seen we get in-quarter ROI. It's I think we're just scratching the surface in what we can do in private sector. But, moving back from the private sector to the public sector, David, what does the state of affairs look like for RPA services? And what is your estimate on the speed of adoption for federal and state and local with your background and the research that you've been doing?
Yeah, well, I think it's going to be a L-shaped curve, quite frankly. We seem to be accelerating RPA adoption through the agencies, but it still seems to me like you go to a conference, you meet someone, you hear the story, you go, well, I could do that too. Someone connects with UiPath or one of the RPA vendors, and they put RPA in. We still have a disconnect because a lot of people don't know of all the exciting things that RPA can do. I mean, and I judge things maybe wrongly, but as a professor, I always try to judge things by personal interaction with people. And all my neighbors here in Arlington, Virginia, work for the federal government, and we'll be walking our dogs with our masks on. And I'll say, you guys use an RPA. And they'll stop and they'll look at me and they'll go, what's RPA? Oh, I guess our IT guys know that. And they're working in some policy office, or they're helping get food to people who are hungry. And I'll be like, well, no, it really could affect you. And they're like, well, I really never heard about it. So then I checked on Capitol Hill, and I know we're not in the lobbying business, but I think there was one piece of legislation that was introduced in the last Congress on RPA and technology. It had some co-sponsors. Mark Meadows, famously the former chief of staff for the president, ex-president, was on it, but it didn't have like 218 members, which you need for a majority. So I thought, well, let me just call some of my friends who are staffers, and they say, I don't deal with technology, David. Don't ask me about it. And I'm like, well, it's not really technology. So I think we're facing a bit of a silo effect yet. And one of the reasons why we are pushing the initiative and really trying to expand it with your great help is to move beyond the silos so more people are aware. Then I think, like it was when we did the digital television transition, there was a moment about a month before all the TVs would shut off for analog and go to digital, where like we went from 35% to 85%. And I'm hoping it'll be true for RPA too, where it just like you're overwhelmed by the number of calls you get, Chris, and you're like, what's going on? I mean, it's too much to handle because everybody wants it and they want it now.
Well, that would be a good problem to have. And
it's a good problem to
have. Well, you're exactly right there, David. This is relatively new technology, and it's one of the fastest growing technologies ever in history. And if you think about that, it's pretty amazing. But we do need to get our government customers to think about automation first, rather than solving it, through people or policy often. And there are some big challenges that I'm excited to start to solve in government, and that have a lot of savings and a lot of efficiency gains, and again, a lot of impact on the ability to deliver benefits to the citizenry. So, but you're right. This is certainly a technology, but it's a technology that has application well beyond the IT environment. In fact, most of our customers are in the functional areas on the mission side, and again, they're back office, but not and I certainly we bring value to the IT organization as well, but it's not a traditional IT technology. It has a much broader impact, and it's just going to be a matter of, through organizations like yours, educating folks on, hey, this is something that you really need to take a look at, and we can solve some big problems. So we've seen some official movement embracing RPA technology among federal agencies, with the publication of the State of Federal RPA published by the Federal RPA Community of Practice last November. David, what did you glean from that report? I mean, how does that impact your view on federal adoption?
Well, I think in a couple of ways. Number one, whenever you have a report, it allows people to have something to read and view and experience. So I think that's a really good thing. I know when I was on Capitol Hill, when a report would be written by a committee, everyone would pay attention to it. So that's very positive. Secondly, they highlighted some of the agencies, differing agencies that were kind of leaders in the RPA practice. There were all sorts of different agencies. It wasn't just, I know USDA is involved with you guys, but it wasn't just USDA. It were some agencies I rarely heard of that were doing things. And I think that allows people the takeaway of, well, if they're doing it, I can do it too. Or I don't need to invest $400 million to do this. Because as you know, a lot of times on information technology, people always want to do it on the cheap because they don't think of it as frontline. They think of it as kind of the last money that we could spend as an economist. At least I think that. So I think that's positive. I think the third thing is when you get one report, you get a second report because it leads people to go, well, give us the update. And then when the update occurs, they're like, oh, there's progress here. More people are doing it, which makes them feel less timid about doing it themselves. And then fourthly, I guess finally, we'll get to the point where all the agencies will be asked by someone, either in the media or maybe in the academic world, for what they're actually doing with RPA. And I know in politics, you can, at least with members of Congress, when you say, well, I'm working on a report card on what you've been doing, and here are our 5 issues, where do you stand? Everyone stands up at salute and says, well, of course we're with you. We want an A. And I think you'll see a massive increase in people using RPA because people don't want to get the F. They don't want to have the D. They don't want to look backwards. They want to be looking forward and progressive and like in touch with what's happening in society. So I think that bodes well as well. I have to give the credit to the community of practice for actually coming up with this idea and we're kind of running with it because it really set the stage, now making it legitimate for literally every federal agency or department to issue their own report if they want to on what they're doing. And that creates momentum. You know, in everybody knows this, but in government, on Capitol Hill, in Washington, in politics, you're always looking for momentum. And if you find momentum, you suddenly want to grab the flag and start running down the street and join the momentum. And I think by setting up this report and releasing it in November, they've really helped create the seeds for more momentum, for more enactment. So those would be the 4 big things I would take away.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. And we've seen OMB mandate some focus on moving from low value to high value work. And I'd love to see, to your point, performance.gov pick this up and start to build some metrics around automating processes and automating low value functions so that we can start to build those scorecards and measure, the adoption. But, GSA has just done a wonderful job in standing up this community of practice and the best practices playbook and really appreciate your perspective on that. So do you see any insurmountable barriers to RPA in the public sector?
Not really. I mean, one, we have to overcome the knowledge silo among staffers and members. So everybody says, get more RPA. If you have 10 members of Congress send a letter to Veterans Affairs and say, we know you guys are doing great work. We encourage you to use more RPA. What signals does that set the Secretary of VA? We should do more of this because Congress likes this. They ultimately fund us and we want Congress to like us more. Not a threat, but just an encouragement. Encouragements do a lot of work in Washington. At least I found they have in my years of Capitol Hill. Secondly, I think the more people use it, using the VA example, the Secretary of the VA can then talk about it more. And if you're Dennis McDonough, who actually went to the same university I went to, we don't know each other, so I'm very proud of him personally and want him to do very well. But when he's out on the hustings talking about how he took VA from the Trump years and made it even better, that's a big plus. And that makes him be a very successful veteran secretary. And I think those are the kind of opportunities you want to create for people. And then maybe thirdly, you just have lots of meetings and lots of, we've gone through COVID. We may have some other unfortunate consequences of COVID with other diseases coming from around the world. But we now have what we learned from this, what really worked, what kind of worked, maybe what didn't work. But then we can, if God forbid this ever happens again to America, we take what really worked and we kind of start with that and then build out from there, which means in my mind, RPA has a very bright future because it worked a lot in helping relieve America of all the onerous problems with COVID-19.
I couldn't agree with you more.
Well, Chris, we're at about 2:43. Let me just, before we get to the questions, and we've got a couple questions, any last thoughts on things to come for RPA and the public agencies, departments in the future?
Absolutely. So, our RPA started out really as like I said, a technology tool set in the back office, but it's quickly evolved to this enterprise capability. And we're seeing this real push now to the fully automated enterprise and the full adoption of the platform, which is really exciting, where you start to think automation first, you automate everything from the back office to the mission. And what's really exciting is the ability to scale the workforce on demand. So you think about the natural cycles of government, whether it's postal during the holidays or IRS during tax season, the ability to start to think about using this technology to build elasticity into your workforce and be able to deal with those peaks and valleys of demand, that starts to get really exciting. And I think we're going to see that. The whole idea of a robot for every person. So a robot is a digital assistant on your endpoint. We've made these bots very intuitive to develop. You don't need to be an IT person or have a developer's background to write one of these bots. Kind of think about, Microsoft Excel 30 years ago, right? Nobody knew how to use it. And then, everybody's been able to write macros and set up an Excel worksheet. Bots are very easy to build and use. And the great thing about this is as we start to get these bots deployed on every endpoint, and we've got a pilot that we're working right now in the Air Force, they call it a robot for every airman. The real value of that is as you democratize the building of these automations, the people, number one, that are closest to doing the work have the best ideas of what to automate and how to automate it, number one. But number two, it allows, look, if I have a job function and I build a bot to offload some mundane task that I have to do every day that consumes a lot of my time, I can then share that automation across all of my peers that have that same job function, and they can realize the same benefit. Now, the other really great thing about the platform is that it has built-in governance and an operating capability and security so that our government customers don't have to worry about this technology propagating on its own or some of the built-in challenges that our government customers perceive in terms of adoption of new technologies. We have security built in, we have operations, we have governance, we can do it at scale, and change control, all of those things that our government customers look for to really start to democratize and move to this a robot for every person kind of digital assistant model. And I really think we're going to see a move toward that. We're already seeing it in a number of government agencies.
Yeah, well, thank you. So we've got two questions, and maybe Chris and I will both jump in. The first question is, how can RPA compete in this era of constrained government resources? We talked a little bit about that with the trillions of dollars being spent, but what would be your answer, Chris?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Any new technology start in government has to kind of fight this battle. What can we replace? Our government customers aren't getting a lot of additional budget, and budget's starting to be cut back, especially on the side of IT. So how do we position ourselves? How do we drive efficiencies for the government customers so that they are able to reprioritize funding? And that's always a challenge. But in fact, RPA can drive hundreds of millions of dollars at the agency level and efficiencies and cost avoidance and help work through these backlogs and help deliver these new programs that are being rolled out and make these programs effective and really get the benefits in the hands of the people that need them when they need them. So some of these constrained resources in government, some of these cutbacks we're seeing are really going to accelerate the adoption of RPA in government. And, if you look at just what happened during COVID, right, like I said, our government customers were doubly burdened having to administer or run their agencies in this telework environment and also administer these programs. And the agencies that were using RPA really leaned into automation to solve that and did so incredibly effectively. So I think this constraint, this time of constraint is going to be a catalyst for RPA adoption and deployment.
Well, excellent. Well, I'll go on to the second question, which maybe I'll jump in first. If you have any additional ideas, Chris, feel free to jump in. How can RPA technology move beyond the IT function so more departments, agencies, and their shareholders and citizens benefit? I would answer that question by education. We really need to aggressively move to a very, I like the word aggressive because I'm an aggressive guy, but aggressively work on educating everybody on the benefits and the problem solving occasions of RPA, because I think if we do that, they'll want to adopt it and they'll want to talk to others. Because one thing I also learned in DC, which all of you are very familiar with, is that people like talking about their successes. Because if they talk about their successes, it makes them feel stronger. It enables them to maybe to be more politically powerful. It just makes them feel better at night when they go home and say, we did this today. We helped more people, and I think through massive education, whether it's webinars, surveys, research, case studies, and just making it aware for them where they are makes it really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. It's really about thought leadership and organizations like George Mason and getting out there with a message and helping educate government and that, hey, this is, I know so many technology vendors, approach government with this silver bullet. Hey, this will solve all of your problems. And I know that fatigues our customers, and they only have so many hours in the day to listen to what new technologies are out there. But partnerships with organizations like GMU are really going to help us drive that thought leadership and say, hey, take a step back. This is different. And to your point, training is really important. Not only training the developers, but training people on the technology, what it is, what it does, and how can it be applied to solve some of these big government problems. And we have a very significant training initiative that we've rolled out across the entire company, but also specifically around our public sector customers. And my goal is to train, we're right now on pace to train about a couple hundred people a month. I really want to see that double. And I'd like to get 5,000 people trained within government on robotic process automation this year. So we're really pushing training because it's all about education and understanding what the technology can do and how, most importantly, how it can benefit the agency.
That's excellent. Well, Chris, that's going to conclude our today's webinar. And I want to thank you and UiPath for participating and helping us with our initiative at George Mason University. This is really to all of our viewers, attendees. I hope you'll stay engaged with us. I hope you will contact us. Go to our LinkedIn page, go to our website. I hope you'll email me at drare@gmu.edu. We want everyone in this sector, anyone interested in making government work better, anyone who wants government to function better, maybe have trust in government increase, to really engage with us, because you all have great ideas and we want to use them and work kind of collectively to build on how we make America a terrific country to live in. And with that, I'll say thank you all for attending and have a great day. And thank you again, Chris, for being with us.
Thank you, David. Really enjoyed it.